Hi, my name's Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor, a clinical supervisor, and an EMDR practitioner. And I want to spend this bit of time sort of simplifying some of the ways that we can look at PTSD and how we can manage and maybe work with PTSD if you're a counsellor or if you're managing PTSD yourself, how you might be able to sort of utilize a bit of this approach to help you grow your awareness around, how you can better look after yourself through that. So, I mean, because there's a lot of theory, we're talking about a lot of neuroscience involved, obviously, with the PTSD process. And, I struggle to remember all of the parts of the brain and what they all do. And, so the way I tend to look at it is like in a very binary way, really, is that there's one part of our brain is the part that is traumatized after a traumatic event. And that part has all of the power at that point. The other part of the brain, which we may say this side of the head just to make it easy to understand, this part is trauma, is that this part of the brain doesn't have the power at that point to challenge this part, to settle this part down, because this part is literally believing, because it's in shock, that the world is a more dangerous place and it maybe needs to be believing. But that's how that tends to be what's happened when somebody is traumatized. The brain will take on board, will go into a sort of hypervigilant state, will believe that the organism is going to die. So it will find ways to protect itself from the threat. So it will project threats. It will be aware that there might be threats there, and it will be consciously focusing on the likelihood of the threat. Whereas our other part of our process might, if it was working more healthily, if it weren't traumatized, would be able to say, hold on a minute, no, do we really need to worry about that? But that part is not going to be working at all once we've been traumatized. So in effect, I mean, a basic summary of PTSD would be a very basic summary. Of course, this is, because it's a 10-minute video. I'll talk in a little bit more in depth in it in other videos. So once if something happens to you, a sudden shock, an accident, or it doesn't even directly happen to happen to you, it could happen to somebody close to you, anything that's enough to frighten you, our brain will have a reaction to that. Now, not everybody's reaction will go into a full PTSD reaction. Some people's trauma reaction, it will be there for a time being, and then they will start to regulate, they'll start to settle. And that can often happen because maybe they've got a more secure emotional system. People with less secure emotional systems, I've found in my work that they're more likely to develop deeper or longer lasting trauma symptoms because they've had historical stuff, historical trauma. So, people who are advantaged and have had like a nurtured upbringing, a lot of support, they don't have like any sort of a personality disorder or a complex personality style that has maybe been sort of, as it come about as a result of early trauma. You know, People without all of that stuff do tend to sort of respond better to trauma. So I guess the main thing to be thinking about with PTSD is that once you've had your traumatic incident, whatever it is that's shocked your brain, the amygdala, it will want to remain traumatized because it wants to stay in that place of hypervigilance because it thinks it needs to keep you alive. So the other part of the brain has very little power against calming that down. So what we want to be doing is we need to start bringing in and activating the logical centers of our brain. So if we call this bit here the logical center, so we need to be analyzing when we feel anxious around something, or if we get triggered, if all of a sudden we're just feeling lots of high levels of a negative emotion, we need to be analyzing that and checking out, is this feeling a fact? Is this what I'm really needing to feel in this moment, or is this a result of the trauma? Because PTSD doesn't necessarily mean you'll just feel a lot of fear. Some people, their fear might be converted into a different emotion. If their brain is more comfortable dealing with a different emotion, it might convert it to shame, for example, or guilt, and then it will manage that shock response by managing those emotions instead of actually the real emotion that's going on. And that's often, people who do that tend to do that because of childhood issues in which they've had to sort of suppress certain emotions or do other emotions because it was safe. It was safer to do an emotion you could hide, like maybe fear, or guilt, shame, something you can hide away, rather than to be really sad or to be really angry. Those emotions might have brought a hostile in, sort of reaction from the environment. So the brain very early on learned to not do that. So when people, in the present get traumatized who don't have the capacity to sort of deal with their fear directly, they might go to a massive shame sort of response and start becoming hyper vigilant about people shaming them, or that people are going to abandon them or leave them. Not necessarily that their fear will just be around fear or anything to do with the accident that's caused the issue, because the brain may not want to think about that accident anymore. So it might dissociate in a level from that, but project all of that fear and energy from that onto another source in the present that it can focus on. So, of course, if we can be really, really conscious and develop a sense of being of challenge within ourselves, to actually, after we've had, been in any shock, to just be checking out every sort of reaction we're having, however small, if it's a fear, guilt, shame, even anger, if it's one of those emotions, we need to be checking out to see if that's an appropriate level of emotion for the situation that's going on in the moment. Because if you're traumatized, your brain is in a hypervigilant place, you're creating far too much stress hormone in your body, you've got too much adrenaline in there, which means you're going to feel everything bigger, which means you're more likely to interpret the feelings you're feeling as actually being real and relevant to a situation. But actually, it might not be relevant to a situation. It might be that the situation that is triggering you is just something that would create like a healthy a level of anxiety which would be easily managed. But if you've got PTSD or you're in shock, you're likely to feel a bigger reaction to that. And if you can't bring in this part of your process to challenge that, you're going to go with that. So therefore you're going to keep on recreating heightened levels of vigilance around things. So what in effect you're working on is trying to grow the logical part, because if you can get stronger at challenging, your brain typically, because neural pathways can reform, the brain typically starts to have more power at challenging this on its own. But at first, you'll have to do a lot of that work yourself. So you need to be doing a lot of reassurance. You need to be talking about to somebody, a professional or somebody, about the trauma. You need to, because if you just dissociate, block it all away, it's likely it could develop into a deeper rooted problem for you later on. So in effect, in early stages of PTSD or after any accident or any significant loss, or even somebody, a close friend was to pass away suddenly, there's a potential there for a big shock, and that could therefore let you into this place of hypervigilance, which, if you can't rationalize and you can't sort of recognize what's a healthy level of reaction, how long should I feel this grief for, or how long, if you can't do that and you get stuck constantly in that cycle, that could cause you significant problems as you go through life, because of course you're going to be stuck in a world of feelings which aren't relevant to the moment, because you're feeling those feelings from the trauma, but they're getting projected onto the present, and your brain is finding ways to keep itself busy with the trauma, because the traumatized brain does not want to stop being traumatized. It wants to stay traumatized because it thinks if it does, you've a better chance of survival. And so that's why it's got a lot of power, and this part hasn't got as much power, because this part's saying, but we the car crash that frightened us, we don't, it doesn't mean to say it'll happen again, but the PTSD the PTSD will say, well, it did happen, so there's a good chance. So I'm going to avoid cars. I'm going to go into to a flight pattern. I'm not going to go anywhere near transport again. That's it for me. So unless we can build up, some sort of argument against that part, we're going to find ourselves sort of avoiding sort of situations or people even that actually there's no need for us to do, and that could really, really hamper our well-being as we move forward. Now, like I say, this is just a brief sort of introduction into how logical thinking can be worked to manage PTSD, and I just wanted to sort of float the idea, and I'll do other videos which will sort of build on this, and use different scenarios and different personalities to show how PTSD, the reactions that different personality styles might have to PTSD, because it's not linear. Like we said earlier with the shame, people have different, they'll have their unique responses. People will have complex responses to trauma, and it's never the same. So for us to examine it a bit more, look at a few more options, look at a few more scenarios, it gets this logical part of the brain pondering this stuff more. So I'll leave you with that, and I will update more videos on this subject. I intend to build up a good library of that. So if you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it, and I'll see you at the next one. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.